Okay, welcome to Palm Sunday, and welcome to Chapter 7. We're looking at racism, and we're looking the voice of your brother's blood, Christianity, ethnic hatred, and genocide in Nazi Germany and Rwanda. So you're getting familiar now with the way in which Stanley sort of does a broad, brief, general overview of a particular ism, and then focuses on two particular countries to explore similarities, differences, if you like. Racism remains an issue for the Church. The Archbishop of Canterbury at General Synod in February, with regard to the Windrush scandal, talked about how it remains an institutional problem for this Church, and as well as other institutions. So we ourselves are yet to get this right, shall we say, as we look at this. So we come to look at the Holocaust, or Shoah. We're looking at 6 million Jews who were systematically executed, killed, and we're looking at about 800,000 to 1 million Tutsi and Hutu killed in Rwanda. Kind of interesting in a way to sort of to see how the was it predominantly a massacre on the Tutsi side or predominantly on the Hutu side, in terms of what went on there? I think I don't know enough about this, but we've got enough to get ourselves going. These numbers, these page numbers, page 150, this is Stanley. You're getting the hang of this now, aren't you? They died because they belonged to an ethnic category whose very existence was deemed to threaten the health and even survival of the nation. And so this is sort of why he's picked on these two particular massacres to do a sort of compare and contrast. Not million is in any way, we're not playing the numbers game of comparative. So we're aware also, says Stanley, of those whose otherness was not racial: homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, disabled, black, Slavs. Surely both of those could be racial. Roma as well, Catholics. So we're aware of the death of those, as well as those who tried to protect them. So that's with regard to the Holocaust. Likewise, those Hutu, they were killed. There's some elements of Hutu who were killed in Rwanda if perceived as collaborating with Tutsis. And we will later see some Hutus who are Tutsified, which at the time was a good thing, I think, before it became a very, very bad thing. But we're also aware of other genocides that are not driven by ethnicity. Stalin's 1930s, Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. So just because you're a genocidal maniac does not mean you're racist. Probably does, let's face it, but it doesn't necessarily. So we're looking at how religious antagonism very often has been inextricably entangled with ethnic hatred. We consider, a million Armenian Christians massacred, forced starvation. There was an issue there where American missionaries driven out of Turkey. They knew about this. They tried to get America involved, but America wanted to stay off, putting pressure on Turkey because they needed that neutral status at the time. You consider the Bosnian crisis of the 1990s, targeting Bosnian Muslims, Serbian Orthodox Christians targeting Bosnian Muslims. That's pretty clearly a direct bit of racial hatred. Right, perhaps not racial hatred, but certainly religious hatred. Okay, so racial hatred doesn't explain all these massacres, but it does contribute significantly to them. Now, we're going to rewind and go back to the Enlightenment philosophy of Voltaire, of David Hume, who had this idea that different races had different origins, the polygamist, polygenist view. And now you weave that in with a Protestant romantic view that saw distinctive peoples as having a distinctive corporate personality, Volksgeist. Those two are going to combine rather unhelpfully add into it an element of the 1910 World Missionary Conference. This is somewhere towards the top of page 51, where there's this desire to respect the racial characteristics of groups that you go mission to. So we become Greek to Greeks, as Paul urges, we become Indian to Indians. But, suggests Stanley, this is a short step before coming to see these different groups as having different moral or intellectual capacities. So for him, it's a short step in that regard. We need to be careful as we do this, and I'll come to this again at the end. Being a Christian, being theologically clever, if you like, doesn't seem to protect these people, doesn't seem to help the Rwandans. 90% of them are baptized in 1990, 63% of the Catholic. How is it possible in such a Christianized Catholic country? How can you have this sort of death happening in that sort of a setting? Now, on the one hand, you could say, well, you could have a high view of nominalism. They're not proper Christians. They were proper Christians, they wouldn't do this. So you can have that approach. But if you overdo your sort of liberal approach to the Christian effect, then you're in danger of overdoing Christianity as a reservoir of ideas and symbols. And we're a broad church. But if you overdo that, then you end up with Christianity having no absolute moral dynamic to contribute. And that sounds quite a horrible thought if that is the case. And you've got to bear in mind that it's all very well for us to look back and go, well, if it was me, I would have spoken out. And you wonder what the next generation or two, as they look back and do church history on us, what will they say about us? Why didn't we speak out about that? Why did we think that was okay? So there'll be bits of that. It's more intelligible to the intellectual zeitgeist of the day that's looking for so just ending up looking for a very much more a Gentile approach. And so in sucking all the Judaism out of Jesus, you end up with this quite raw contrast between the legalism of the Jews and the liberty of coming under the grace of Christ. And so you go from there quite quickly into sort of viewing Jews as part of the problem. And you can see then Hitler coming along. This is page 52, using Luther. Now this is where you need to get Moira onto this. What with her Reformation stuff, she'd love this. You should be pushing her on Luther and his anti-Semitic stuff. My understanding of that is that it's a later Luther, and that to begin with, Luther is very, what's the opposite? Pro-Semitic. His view is that as we explain the doctrine of grace, that the Jews will go, oh, all right, and they would convert. So initially his view is that with the joy of Reformation, they will convert. But his later views is, well, maybe we should compel them to come in, as Augustine ended up doing for the Donatists. So Hitler using Luther, I'm not comfortable with that. It's bad enough. Luther's anti-Semitism towards the end is bad in itself. And so you end up with Diarmaid MacCulloch. He sees this anti-Semitic taint, and it runs through Chalcedonian Christianity as a line all the way through that. So we come to race and religion in Nazi Germany. And you've got the sort of the plot there of how this develops, and you don't need me to unpack that. And hopefully you can think for yourself of different heroes. Corrie ten Boom ought to be up there in your list of heroes to be enjoying and celebrating. And there's various others there, and I'm sure you can add to them. I'd be interested to have you add to them. On to page 54, we have this. There's this comforting narrative here. Do we want to view Christianity and Nazism as fundamentally opposed? Nazism is really a neo-pagan pseudo-religion It's trying to bring in a pre-Christian Norse culture kind of approach. That's the sort of thing that you'll find in that book, which I made a small plug of at the original start of the course when I was doing my book review. There's a sense of well, we wouldn't have done it; it wouldn't have happened to us. Because Nazism and Christianity is so very different. But there's the sense that in which for many that's not how it was. Nazism sponsored German Christians. They became the dominant group of the established evangelical church in 1933, and it required the resistance of Martin Niemöller to set up the confessional church, Barmen Declaration, and so on, and Q. Bonhoeffer. So you add into this ingredient, you have the silence of the Pope. Now, I think since I wrote this, the Pope has opened his doors, which of course are now shut on account of our social distancing. But he momentarily opened them for people to come in, scholars to come and look at the correspondence, because there's this perpetual shadow disappointment with the papacy in terms of how it failed to speak out about what it knew of the Jews and their Holocaust. Diamond McCulloch has, what shall I say, an element of kindness here, as he points to the paper With Burning Anxiety that gets smuggled into Germany in 1937. So there's an element of kindness, I feel, from Diamond McCulloch in this regard. But as ever, there's this concern. The Holocaust could not be understood merely as the work of a comparatively small group of crazed ideologues, but on the contrary, involved the willing cooperation of multiple actors. Ordinary Germans who staffed the concentration camps and manned the police battalions and were charged with slaughtering Jews. It's this small, everyday littleness. What do? I just drove a train. That's all I did. Driving trains, nothing wrong with driving trains. What do? I just helped people get onto trucks. That's all I did. Nothing wrong with helping people getting onto trucks. And it's that sense. So page 161, that's a reference to Stanley. I realize why it might confuse you, because immediately in brackets there's a reference to Goldhagen's Hitler's Willing Executioners, which is a book on my I would like to have time to read list. But there we go. So over the page to 56, and you've got, the what would I have done element. You've got then some quotes from Bonhoeffer. But what I want to look at next is Rwanda. So what we were trying to do there is contrast the degree to which we say Christianity and Nazism are fundamentally opposed, and the degree to which we say, well, there are Venn diagram elements that come together, and that has been part of the messiness of Christian history, as we see in the papacy, for example, and perhaps in other elements of our church history. So to Rwanda. And here, over 800,000 died, an extended period of massacring by Hutu majority on Tutsi minority. There you are. I should have just read my own notes and I would have remembered it. There's a moment of it in 1959, but then it's between April and July of 1994 that is the key. That is the big massacring moment. It looked like a sinister upsurge of primeval tribal Africa. They'd lived side by side in the same villages, they'd intermarried and so on. A lot of Hutu were poor peasant cultivators, but some managed to own cattle and some managed to be wealthy enough to be, the phrase is Tutsified, to be looked upon as if they were Tutsis. And the reason why that's relevant is because on the whole, it was the Tutsis who found themselves having the office of chief. And you remember when we were looking at the Catholic approach to mission, how a lot of that started with education, a lot of it started with looking at the important people, and so there's a circularity in which you draw on the important educated groups, and by doing so, they become the powerful people. And so, in a sense, that's what you want, because by investing faith in the powerful people, they'll be the movers and shakers. They might be the people who can then shape this community, this country. So you got some element of sympathy here, but what starts to happen is the Tutsis, who find themselves in power, they start to say, let's have less church involved in our schooling education. I don't know the degree to which that's a coincidence, just at the time at which the Hutus are saying, oh, we quite like the idea of education. Can we join in on this education thing? And so increasingly, it's the Hutus who are making up a majority in the church. Now, along come the next generation of missionaries, bearing in mind here, we're just in the period of entering the 60s. Liberation theology is the thing. And so we should not be surprised to find that these missionaries are not taking the approach that I mentioned earlier, but instead they're taking the side of the poor. They're being prophets for the poor. And so you have this moment, 1959, Hutu militias attack Tutsis. Hundreds died, thousands fled. And between 62 and 94, you've got this sort of mutual hostility between Hutus and Tutsis rising up. Now, in the process of that, a lot of exiled Tutsis start attacking or trying to reinvade their home country. And in the process of that, the Hutu government are able to say those attacking Tutsis, they're attacking. They are, what would we say today, terrorists, we'd be saying. 1994, the Hutu government-controlled media depicts the Tutsis as cockroaches. And hopefully at this point you go, isn't that what was said of the Jews by anti-Semitic Nazis? And that what was said before. So hopefully you're getting those kind of similar bells ringing. And then here's this spark moment, this disaster, where the Hutu president and the Tutsi president are both killed, or Tutsi president of Burundi, Hutu president of Rwanda, are both killed by rockets fired at their plane. I'm guessing they're both in the same plane. And you're left going, well, what happened there? But this seems to be the spark of the massacre that then follows. Churches, previously a safe sanctuary, now become the focal point of the killing ground. And so thousands of Tutsis are slaughtered. 11% of the population, they think, died. And the daily killing rate is 5 times higher than the Nazi concentration camps. 3 out of 4 of the Anglican clergy seem to swallow this, viewing genocide, and they justify it as self-defense against those made into external enemies of the state. Oh, this is difficult. So we conclude with this call. We as the church, we as Christians, we are to be prophets. We are to speak to power. We are to speak truth and love to power. In order to do that, you need to be trusted, you need to be close, but then you need to have enough distance to make yourself, give yourself an independent perspective and distancing. How do you balance that? And so we see how one of the problems with the church, top page 59, is how the churches were bringing some level of comprehensible and tolerableness to the genocide and the violent action that was happening. These aren't the only ones. Ku Klux Klan, Bosnian genocide, we could have made more reference to. But there's this awareness of sinfulness that ought to lead Christians, not in the first instance to censure the behavior of others, but to continual self-criticism and repentance. Christianity proclaims a gospel of redemption from sin, but what Christians find hardest of all is to recognize the extent to which evil can infect even the company of the redeemed. Racism. I'm afraid we haven't finished with it. I'm sorry for that.